Thank you. Uh, Thanks, Alex. Thanks to Dawn for having me and for assembling this. Um, I'll try to quickly set this backdrop here of trying to draw out some parallels between what Israel did in Gaza over the last 2.5, 3 years, um, and what it's currently doing in Lebanon, and the ways that the Israeli strategy is connected to an earlier strategy, the Dahi doctrine, that was developed in Lebanon in the war in 2006. So I think in a lot of ways, Gaza represents, and this might seem pretty obvious, but a new pinnacle for this type of wholesale destruction and erasure, um, and of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, of large scale destruction that we've rarely seen before in modern warfare as a military strategy, and often focused on the use of overwhelming and disproportionate force against civilians and infrastructure. I think one of the seeds of this strategy, there are ways to take it back to the Nakba. There are ways, and I think Maya will probably speak to this. She's written some interesting things recently about the parallels of the Nakba and how the people of South Lebanon are experiencing a Nakba, their own Nakba today. But I want to focus at first on the Dahi doctrine and the way that those seeds planted 2 decades ago. Um, and the ways we saw them play out in subsequent wars on Gaza leading up to the genocide in 2023. So in simple terms, the Dahi doctrine, named after the southern suburbs of Beirut, a place where hundreds of thousands of people live, you'll often see it represented in Western media reports as Hezbollah stronghold. It's the political base for a lot of Hezbollah's leaders. Certainly, it's where a lot of Hezbollah leaders and members do live, but it's also a place where hundreds of thousands of Lebanese people also live. And that way of dehumanizing it all as a Hezbollah stronghold is one of the things that got us to this point, is one of the, at least, media misrepresentations, and political misrepresentations that got us to this point. So in July of 2006, Hezbollah carried out a cross-border attack and abducted 2 Israeli soldiers. They were hoping to exchange those soldiers for Lebanese prisoners who were still being held by Israel. And that instigated a 34-day war in which Israel destroyed large parts of South Lebanon and the southern suburbs, the Dahi. So the Israeli military in that war crippled Lebanon's infrastructure. They bombed bridges, power plants, sewage treatment plants, hospitals, ports, and Beirut's airport. You can see the parallels to today, I guess, minus the port and the Beirut airport. Israel also imposed an air and sea blockade on Lebanon. And all of this happened with support, unwavering support for quite some time from George W. Bush and his administration. And there, too, it's hard not to see the parallels with the Biden-Trump administration unwavering support for Israel and Gaza 2 decades later, and the chain of events that led us to. In 2006, the Bush administration helped prolong the war for weeks. It blocked several ceasefire resolutions at the UN Security Council. Bush and his advisors argued it would be premature for Israel to end its assault on Lebanon before inflicting more damage on Hezbollah. And at one point, Condi Rice, who was Bush's Secretary of State at the time, famously described the war as, quote, the birth pangs of a new Middle East. So that war 20 years ago was full-throated American backing, the methods of total destruction, helped pave the way for Israel's subsequent wars on Gaza in 2008, in 2012, 2014, 2021, and eventually to the total siege, mass starvation, and genocide that Israel unleashed after 2023. So the Dahi Doctrine was articulated in that war in 2006. It called for the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure and civilians, and the use of massive and disproportionate force in Israel's subsequent military campaigns. Gadi Eisenkot, who was the head of the Israeli military's Northern Command during the 2006 war, later explained the doctrine in somewhat chilling terms about 2 years later in 2008. And this is quoting Eisenkot. He said, quote, "What happened in the Dahi quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, there are no civilian villages. They are military bases," end quote. And in case anyone doubted that this was Israel's official policy back in 2008, Eisenkot added, quote, "This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it has been approved." And so from that point forward, Israel built its military doctrine on the use of disproportionate force, on the use of collective punishment, and on destroying civilian infrastructure, all of which are acts that obviously constitute war crimes and are prohibited by international humanitarian law. And while segments of the Israeli military set about to lay out this policy, Israeli think tanks and other parts of the security establishment also set out to create justifications for I think it would be an understatement to call it an illegal and immoral policy. In late 2008, Gabi Siboni, who was the director at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, and he himself was also a former military officer, wrote a paper arguing that Israel must use overwhelming force and target infrastructure so that Lebanon and Israel's other enemies, he mentioned Syria and others in that paper, get bogged down for years rebuilding their shattered economies and countries. Quote, "Such a response aims at inflicting damage and meting out punishment to an extent that will demand long and expensive reconstruction pressures," he wrote. He called the strategy a way to ensure Israel's long-term deterrence. He also argued it should be applied in the same way in Gaza. Now, of course, history is full of examples of dominant military powers trying to deploy overwhelming force to quell insurgencies, native insurgencies, from Algeria to Vietnam to Iraq, only to fail in suppressing the long-term supposed threats to themselves. But the Dahi doctrine took hold in Israel. Its proponents gained prominence, they gained power. Eisenkot went on to serve as chief of staff of the Israeli military until he retired in 2019. And then Benjamin Netanyahu appointed him to Israel's emergency war cabinet after the October 2023 attack. He might run for in the next elections. And now, just to bring us back to the present day briefly, in the latest invasion of Lebanon, Israel's leaders and political leaders, military leaders, they no longer threaten to punish Lebanon with the Dahi doctrine. They're now invoking a worse fate. They're invoking Gaza, the total destruction of Gaza. In late March, early April, the defense minister, Israel Katz, he said that Israeli troops would destroy all houses in Lebanese border towns in accordance with the model used in Rafah and Beit Hanun. So with no one to stop Israel from systematically destroying housing, infrastructure, the means of life in Gaza's largest towns and cities, it rendered many of them uninhabitable. This is putting aside the tremendous death toll and other human cost. Nothing prevented it from doing the same in southern Lebanon in the last 2.5 months. I'll stop there and we can pick up other elements of the conversation and bring us to the present day, as we talk. Thanks again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mohammed. I want to turn over to other panelists to kind of discuss those points a little bit, the connection between Gaza and Lebanon and other points that Mohammed just raised. Maya, maybe I'll go to you first and then Jad.
Sure. And thanks for putting this panel together to discuss this, Alex. Just to follow on Muhammad's sort of mapping out of this sort of movement between doctrines and escalation also between different doctrines. I want to point out also the importance of really underscoring here what the logic is, which is pressure, mass punishment, basically in order to have that should result in sort of political changes. And it's not only the movement here from the Dahye doctrine to the Gaza doctrine, which is just basically a sort of open threat of genocidal violence, an open threat of the wholesale destruction without any consequence. I think that's a really important part of this, is that baked into this sort of threat is the idea that there will be no consequence, whether internationally or at any sort of scale for these Israeli crimes, because that is the precedent that has been set in Gaza. I also want to note another doctrine, mowing the lawn, which Israel innovated in 2008 in regards to Gaza, where, and it's something also to point to here in all of these the policies of naming. This policy was really about dehumanized to the Palestinians to an extent where they were like grass that would be mowed every once in a while, of futurity and of resistance. And I think part of what is happening here beyond the Dahya doctrine and the Gaza doctrine is Israel's will to impose a policy like mowing the lawn in South Lebanon, to create South Lebanon as a zone of a very porous zone for multiple forms of intervention, and again, the repeated mowing of any kind of possibility of resistance. And I think there was a desire to do that also in Iran, and it quickly failed. So part of what we're seeing here are the escalations of these and the sort of putting together of all of these so-called doctrines. But what ultimately allows this to happen is impunity. Only imagine the forms of impunity required to use genocidal violence as a threat, an open threat. That's really the stakes of what we're talking about here. But I also think it's important to just note a couple of differences between Gaza and Lebanon. First is that in Gaza, there is nowhere to go. It was essentially turned into a shooting pen, a bombing pen, a shooting pen. Uh, you know, Thankfully, there are still places for people to go to flee Israeli violence in Lebanon, where, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, but, you know, even if they are met in multiple ways, some negative in their displacement, there are still places to go. So I think that distinction and that limit case allows us to think about Lebanon and Gaza and Palestine more generally, with both paying attention to similarities, but also pointing out the differences, and thus the stakes of moving these doctrines across these sort of different geopolitical realities and these different scales and these different political projects ultimately that Israel has in Lebanon and in Palestine.
Thanks, Maya. And I'm going to share a piece that you wrote back in March about the wages of impunity, which I love that line. It's really, really important to hit that note because it's a major component of all of this. Jad, I want to go to you for any additional thoughts on this subject. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll just add something very briefly on something that I believe was particularly distinct in the Lebanese case, which ties back to something that Muhammad said, and that is this dehumanization. I mean, we saw how dehumanization was used as a weapon to divide people and to
We might be losing Jed.
create the sense of fear surrounding, particularly the. And, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there's a minor delay
Yeah.
perhaps, but maybe just try to go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay.
Jed. If there's an
All right.
issue,
I
I'll
was
raise
I
it and
was
yeah.
okay. I was just saying that Israel managed to create this fear of the Shia community, and we saw a few examples on the border of the Christian villages in particular, saying that anyone housing displaced Shia members will be targeted. And then we saw it later on in Beirut, especially after the Black Wednesday attack, where what followed was a map published by the Arabic spokesperson of the Israeli military saying that uh, Hezbollah and Bahia are now co-locating amongst other Christian areas in Beirut. And essentially, he conflated the Shia community with Hezbollah, making the Shia community a target in creating this separation between different sects in Lebanon and this internal division that ultimately feeds into the Israeli narrative and weakens Lebanon internally and benefits Israel.
Thanks, Chad. I know I really appreciate that. And it's important to discuss the divisive nature of the assault itself. It's really important, especially given Lebanon's history, the very long civil war, the sectarian nature of that, how that was divisions were utilized in that war too by external forces. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up as well. I want to jump over now to the regional component a little bit. Maya, I'm going to turn to you. We have this MOU. There is this kind of bizarre debate, right, about Lebanon's inclusion in the MOU, even though it's explicitly stated in the MOU. What I'm trying to perhaps get into here is, can you discuss that ceasefire and Israel's particular role in ignoring it thus far, and frankly, stated role in ignoring it? What has the U.S. done, or can the U.S. do to ensure that ceasefire extends to Lebanon in support of the Lebanese people?
I'll start at the end of that question, which is that I don't think we should I think we need to understand the United States as an active, complicit actor, in this war and in Israel's, seventh invasion of Lebanon. So it's, to read, like, it's not as if the United States is a sort of outside actor playing this good role of a mediator, what it can and what it cannot do. It's an active participant in this Nakba, as Jad was speaking, this Nakba of people from South Lebanon and specifically the Shia community in Lebanon. So the first thing that it can obviously do is stop this war. And we should remember that this escalation of the war began when the United States launched an illegal war of choice against Iran. So that's the first thing they can do, stop this war. And, it's not as if the United States doesn't have the power to stop Israeli aggression and escalation in Lebanon. It just has chosen not to use that power so far. So I think part of what's happening here is a misunderstanding of terms or a confusion of terms, where you have the attempt to negotiate a settlement to an illegal war of an aggression. And within that attempted negotiation is the question of whether separation or linking of different fronts in that regional and international war. And the two sort of negotiation tracks or discussion tracks that are currently at play are on those two tracks, delinking and linking, or understanding the war as regional or as sort of separate actors, wars within wars that can be delinked. And I think it's really important here to note that the word ceasefire, even the question of achieving a ceasefire, it has been kind of rendered meaningless, or at least it has been watered down to the extent that we have to continuously explain that when there is a ceasefire between Israel and another actor, what that usually means is that Israel continues to fire and the other actors cease. And here, I think, again, Gaza is a good example where about 1,000 people have been killed in Gaza since the Trump brokered ceasefire. And a further chunk of Gaza has been occupied under the terms of the ceasefire. And that is, again, also in Lebanon from November 2024 until March 2nd, what ceasefire meant was that Israel had total, complete freedom of movement to destroy civilian infrastructure, terraform parts of the South to make it uninhabitable, and to create effective demilitarized, depopulated zones, extend their occupation, and kill over 400 people. So I think the danger, what's happening now is that part of the tension is that Hezbollah and other Lebanese actors and Iran are saying that that's not going to fly this time. So this ceasefire, it's not going to fly this time, where the ceasefire is just another word for war by other means, but with much less checks on the aggressor. So that's sort of the framework that we should understand, even the term when we say like, oh, will there be a ceasefire, or what will that ceasefire look like? We should understand what it means on the ground um, for the people who live under Israel's aggression, which is that the difference may be a slow asphyxiation, slow violence under a ceasefire, or a sort of cataclysmic one under a sort of official war. So these dual tracks are moving. And I think, part of what's interesting here is that these dual tracks are also being led by two different members of the Trump administration. Uh, Two men who I think both have presidential ambitions in the United States. And that is J.D. Vance with the Switzerland talks that were hosted recently in Switzerland, and the articulation of the terms of the MOU. And on the other hand, that is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is sponsoring these Washington-based direct conversations and talks between the Lebanese government and the Lebanese president and the Israeli government, which is really, I have to say, not only incredibly divisive, but it goes beyond divisive. It goes to for many, this is really incredibly insensitive and is actually an aggressive act. And I think these are some of the divisions here that are worth, if we have time, mining, really trying to get into. But so you have these two sort of different tracks that are all about linking or delinking, and they seem to be almost they're happening. The content is quite different in the conversations that are coming out, but I think on the when it comes to the Washington talks, the main aim of the Israeli state is to legitimize its occupation of Lebanon. And it aims to do so through having public conversation, public discussion with the Lebanese government. And one of the mechanisms of this kind of legitimation is both an American and an Israeli demand of the Lebanese army to directly coordinate with Israel's army in South Lebanon. Thus far, the army has refused to do so because it understands that this is sort of a request for it to almost commit suicide as an institution, and as an institution that holds many different publics together in Lebanon. And on the other hand, here, I think that one way you can maybe think about them together rather than just be confused by how they seem to be operating on such different tracks is to actually think about them in a kind of syncing, such that, if it has been proven true that in fact these fronts are linked, and that in fact it is Iranian pressure that put any concessions actually into effect on the Israeli side, you can sort of understand these dual track negotiations as also providing cover for the Israeli government, and to some extent the Lebanese government, to say that these concessions are happening, in conversations between two states, rather than the more obvious point, which is that this is happening because the United States and Iran are working out a deal, and the United States is putting incredible pressure on Israel for now to make these concessions.
Thanks, Maya. And I think it's important, like as you were saying, to especially focus on that normalization component, like the normalization of Israeli presence in Lebanon, of bombing, of these things. It's a huge part of this. Mohammed, I want to go to you because I know you just released an op-ed today on the subject of kind of U.S. What the U.S. can or should do or will it do to kind of rein in Israel. So maybe you can talk about that, kind of pairing up with what Maya was just discussing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with almost all of what Maya laid out, and especially her point about these the dual tracks and the basic fact that essentially the Lebanese government has no leverage over Israel, whereas Iran now has leverage over both the U.S. and in Israel indirectly that way, and possibly also directly by changing the equation in a few weeks ago after the one of the Israeli attacks on Dahi, and where Iran fired back directly at Israel um, after that attack. So that's one of the political realities here, and there's segments of the Lebanese political structure that wants to deny that reality, that they don't actually have any leverage, and their trust is essentially in somehow this. It's wishful thinking. I mean, that's that the Trump administration will somehow pressure Israel to withdraw from Lebanon on the basis of helping preserve or protect the current government, the current political structure in Lebanon, um, while the real points of leverage are with Iran. Now, it's a separate question of what that means for Lebanon's sovereignty, for Lebanon's political structure, for Lebanon's political future. And it's important not to mix those two questions together. But the aim, I think, right now has to be to stop Israeli attacks and aggression in Lebanon, and also to ensure an Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon. And what we've seen in previous, certainly in the ceasefire deals or alleged ceasefire deal in Gaza, is Israel will tie up withdrawal endlessly to never. I mean, you can also go back to Oslo and post-Oslo arrangements. It's not an innovation only in Gaza. It will tie up to these so-called security arrangements. It will tie up withdrawal for years and essentially never withdraw. Um, and demand impossible verification standards for how Hezbollah is disarmed. The kind of the Israeli ideal would certainly be the Lebanese army serves the role of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority security forces in the West Bank. That would be their ideal arrangements, and I think Maya's right. That would essentially be suicide for the Lebanese army, which has spent considerable effort to portray itself and position itself as the one kind of cross-sectarian institution in Lebanon post-Civil War. Israel certainly doesn't care about that. I don't think the Trump administration cares about that. And one other quick point on this, there's a lot to talk about in the role of the Lebanese army, the role of the Lebanese government, and I think Jad will probably touch on some of this as well. But I think one thing in the debate that's relevant for our Dawn audience is the debate in Washington often centers around this idea of how can we get the Lebanese army up to speed or up to par, or how can we get it to take over security when it's, that's also that I'm having trouble finding the right word to describe it. It's a theater. It's an absurd political theater because for decades, Israel has actually prevented the proper arming and training of the Lebanese army. So even if you were to, when you accept that approach and that it is important to strengthen the Lebanese army and the Lebanese army to exert control and be able to defend Lebanon. I think one of the most interesting and honest quotes we saw maybe about a year ago now from Tom Barak, who is the advisor who I forget if at that point he had the Lebanon file or not, but he had the Syria file, and he had a great interview where he basically said, "Are you kidding? We're not going to arm the Lebanese army to fight Israel. We're going to arm them to fight Hezbollah." I mean, for years, Israel would object when we're not talking about giving U.S. sending or selling or granting F-16s to Lebanon. They would object to the Lebanese army getting night vision goggles and night vision equipment because they would argue it would fall into the hands of Hezbollah. So how can you build a semi-modern army with these kinds of restrictions? And this ruse, I think people in Lebanon, or more people in Lebanon, are realizing it after seeing this past war. I mean, there's also there are questions about and questions that should be asked and discussed of how much responsibility Hezbollah bears and other forces bear on this. But having the Lebanese government issue a quick order for the Lebanese army to withdraw, and and I can see that they didn't want them to be massacred. But it also lays bare that this was a joke that sort of was perpetuated by multiple Democratic and Republican administrations in the U.S., sort of working with Israeli administrations to constrain the Lebanese army so that it could never serve a proper purpose of defending the country.
Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, and so I think that goes really well into what I wanted to ask Jad, which was kind of the reform government's role within all of this. I think Maya made a really good point too about the role of stoking divisions. Maybe if you could talk about that a little bit as well within kind of the Israeli Lebanese kind of government talks. I know it's a lot to do, maybe in 5 minutes, but yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Alex. I think before that, we need to backtrack a bit to when this government was formed, because I think the main contradiction facing this government is that it came to be promising reform and promising a break from the previous way of doing things, but it quickly found itself grappling with a lot more fundamental question, which is the question of state authority and state legitimacy. In Lebanon, reforms have always been understood in this technocratic sense: public administration reform, IMF negotiations, judicial independence, so on and so forth. And all these are incredibly important. They're vital to restoring trust with the government, for restoring legitimacy. But in order for these to succeed, there are fundamental questions like who governs Lebanon, who controls decisions of war and peace, and do citizens view their state as a sovereign actor? And to its credit, this government has done some things which are a bit different than its predecessors. It has tried to establish an international record as a sovereign actor. It has tasked the Lebanese armed forces with this armament plan that was in process until it was halted on the 2nd of March, and the first phase of that was done. And it has tried, at least symbolically, to have a monopoly of arms. And it seems that regionally, there are certain actors that do view this government as politically distinct. We recently saw a decision by Saudi Arabia, for example, to lift a 5-year import ban on Lebanese products. But I think the failures are just as, if not more important. And I think the main failure, and it was briefly mentioned in your introduction, is security. This government has failed to prevent another war from happening. It has failed in managing a displacement crisis for 20% of the country, of its population. It has been subpar in managing the social and sectarian consequences of the displacement crisis. And even before March 2nd, before this war, the government did not perform during the 15-month ceasefire. It did not initiate a reconstruction plan, even though it had a minimal $250 million loan from the World Bank. It did not halt Israeli violations of the ceasefire, and it did not provide any alternative for the citizens of South Lebanon in order to trust it. But I think a more fundamental failure is legitimacy. This government expects its citizens to trust it just because it speaks reform language. But citizens trust the state when it's there for them, when it protects them, when it communicates with them, and when it does things that materially and visibly improves their everyday life. And right now, people aren't seeing that this is the case. And frustration goes even beyond security. Because even when it comes to technocratic reforms, which this government boasts about, more and more people are increasingly seeing that this new form of governance is old governance masked under new language. We've seen a series of bad reformist decisions, a bad financial gap law, gas and VAT and tax increases during crisis, very questionable judicial, institutional, and administrative appointments. But I think a very fundamental failure is that this government still does not control the political conditions that lead to war and peace. It does not even control the escalation. And I think the best example of that is this week. The only ceasefire that has more or less held in certain areas in South Lebanon is the one that came after an MOU between the US and Iran, not after the Lebanese Israeli talks in Washington, D.C. Because even though each of these talks ended with a ceasefire extension, that led to more death, more destruction, more killing, more displacement. And this brings me to the question of Hezbollah. I think it is faulty to limit or reduce the relationship between the government and Hezbollah as mere confrontation, because Hezbollah is a lot more than a military power. It's a political party. It's a social network. It's a welfare provider, and most importantly, it's an actor that for decades has provided itself as the alternative for the state, because the state was absent for decades in South Lebanon and other peripheral areas in Dahia and in Biqa'. Um, and so Western voices and Western opinions that call for a military confrontation between the Lebanese army and between Hezbollah in order to disarm it are ridiculous. The government doesn't have the capacity, the coercive measure, or the domestic and political consensus to disarm Hezbollah militarily, and any military confrontation would lead to destabilization and potentially a civil war. But at the same time, the government cannot ignore the question of Hezbollah, because that is end of disarmament and monopoly of weapons, because that is essential for authority and for sovereignty and for legitimacy. So it finds itself in this predicament, and in parallel, there is pressure on Hezbollah itself from its community, because this arrangement that has held for a long time, in which decisions of deterrence of war and peace are taken outside of formal state authority, is becoming too costly, and people are getting frustrated with continuous displacement, destruction, death, and so on and so forth. But this is not translating to trust in the government, and that is not automatically translating to state legitimacy. So I think, and this is, I think, is the dangerous governance vacuum. And so I think moving forward, the real test will be whether this government will be able to move beyond internationally recognized reformist decisions or disarmament language to actually being present in the everyday life of its citizens, because and replacing and filling the gaps that have for so long been filled by other actors, because reform in Lebanon means nothing when the state lacks legitimacy.
Thanks, Jad. That was all really great, and I think it's really important to discuss the reform government within all of this. Its role is important. It's also lacking, right, as you said. And so, Maya, I want to go to you, just aware of the time as well as we kind of go into a second round here. I wanted to actually jump to you to see if you could kind of discuss that governance component more, the war's impact on different Lebanese groups, especially marginalized groups, kind of humanize that component a little bit more beyond the governance component itself for us briefly.
Sure. Before that, and mindful of time, I want to just underline two things that both Mohamad and Jad spoke about, which are, I think, can be expanded just a little bit, which is that while Lebanon has no leverage in these negotiations with the United States, what it's counting on is also, the United States has leverage on Lebanon. And I think that's kind of what is part of the compulsion, what happened in these decision to do negotiations. That leverage is financial, that leverage is political, And that leverage is also the fact that the United States is the main funder and trainer of the Lebanese army, down to the salaries, boosting the salaries, providing a minimum, small minimum to each member of the armed forces of Lebanon. That is actually an incredible amount of leverage to have over a country that is still experiencing one of the worst financial and economic um, and corruption, on a national scale, kind of bankruptcies people are still navigating this. That is an incredible amount of leverage. And one of the calculations may have been, okay, we don't have leverage, but the United States has different forms of leverage over both the United States, over both Lebanon and Israel. And it's within that gap that there may be some movement. I think it's a total fantasy that the Lebanese government thinks that it can, you know, that there is daylight, basically, and that it can exploit this daylight between the Israeli and American positions, or any daylight that is not totally self-serving, and maybe ultimately just, not long term. And in terms of the governance structures here, it's also important to remember that Hezbollah is a member of the government. So is its main ally, main political ally, the Aman movement. And what that means is that also we should always keep in mind that these ministers have not withdrawn from the government, which in the sort of Lebanese political culture, if not letter, would cause a big legitimacy crisis for this government. And so there are certainly, as Jad was saying, conversations happening, but the relationship is not all only adversarial. Let's put it that way. There are conversations, deals, and a mutual benefit thus far in not moving towards a caretaker government, which has its own set of challenges at such a critical moment for people. You know, and here I just want to point out how both of these, how the current prime minister was brought into power, came to power, and the current president was after a stalemate and a vacancy that began with a series of sort of protests and then a series of crises that hit the country, which no government has been able to ameliorate at all, including this one. So for the current government now to decide that it's going to rest its reputation of reform on the most difficult component, the most explosive component of what they said their program would be, which is this question of the concentration of weapons in the state's hands, is very, I think, ill-advised, precisely because they haven't been able to do any, as Jad was saying, do any of the things that directly affect people's lives, and that are much more popular, right? They haven't actually built that consensus through actions that are truly popular among a majority of people. And I think it's important to say that the current prime minister's ability to take really unpopular decisions has to do with the fact that he does not have a popular base. He is not the kind of model of leadership that comes from wide popular support. This is seen as a technocratic government and as a US backed government. And that's kind of in terms of marginalized groups, and I know that was the original question, Alex. I mean, and all of Mohamad and Jad can also speak to this. I mean, this war is absolutely devastating, and it layers on to a previous devastating war, and it layers on to previous devastations, including, bankruptcies and ex like the explosion at the port. And here, I think it's important to note that wars don't only affect marginalized groups, they create marginalized groups. What I mean by that is that, first of all, they compound the already existing sort of structures of inequality. And it's really important to note here that Lebanon is not just made of Lebanese citizens, And it's not just Lebanese citizens who live in Dahieh or who live in the south or the Bekaa or in all of these areas that are being mercilessly attacked. It's also full of Palestinian refugees, Syrian refugees and workers, migrant laborers. Uh, when we speak about Lebanon, we're not only speaking about Lebanese citizens. This is an incredibly complex society, an incredibly diverse society. The other thing to note here, beyond the sort of norm, like what we would expect in terms of marginal groups, young people who are not in school, and who are experiencing all kinds of violence, um, sort of disabled people. There's also how wars marginalize different segments of the population. I just want to make a really quick point about one of these segments that isn't spoken of, I think, enough, which is that it marginalizes men and makes them very vulnerable to violence, such that this kind of war that is being waged in such a way that says that any man or older boy from 16 to 60 is potentially a combatant. And thus, if Israel draws a line and says, okay, any boy or man across this line is a combatant, right? And is killable in that way. That is an experience of marginalization and vulnerability that, is based on racism, based on forms of architectures of gender and racism coming together. And it's not spoken enough, but there are really heartbreaking stories, right? About, let's say, men in Dahi who are sleeping outside of their houses because they think that they will be targeted. And if maybe they stay away from their families will be safe. And I think that is getting less, in addition to the fact that 4,000 people have been killed since this escalation in March. More than 1 million people have been displaced. Entire, we're talking about like almost, I think, 18,000 housing structures, housing units have been destroyed, in addition to thousands and thousands and thousands of others that have been damaged. So I don't think you can really downplay the extent of destruction that we're witnessing and the deep fear that there is no way to actually harness all the resources needed to deal with this, what it would take to reconstruct. Nor is there any sense today. I think the Israeli prime minister said, we're not leaving. We're not leaving this security zone, no matter what. We're not leaving. We're here to stay. And about 200,000 people will be, permanently displaced. And this leads to what Jad was saying about the sort of myopia of this government's decisions without thinking about what the long-term social and political effects of these forms of, and economic effects of these forms of displacement take, and not taking that into consideration in how it talks um, about this war and its position vis-a-vis the United States, and what the United States is treating as a proxy these days, Israel.
Thanks, Maya. And I think your point on, wars create marginalized groups as well as have impacts on existing ones is really, really important when we think about things like displacement, destruction of property. These are real problems in a country that already has economic, issues and plenty of other things going on that impact regular people. So I really appreciate that you said that. Um, we're running really low on time. I think we've actually managed to largely address most of the Q&A questions through just kind of our flowing conversation. And so, excuse me, what I want to do actually now is just go over to Mohammed just for kind of a basic question, and maybe this can serve as our kind of closing statements. Mohammed, it's a simple question, very hard to answer possibly, but maybe not. How does this war end? Well, how does this end? How do we reach a point in which the Lebanese people are not stuck in a nightmare that is beyond their control? Go ahead, please.
It is a basic question. It is very difficult to answer, and for basically a lot of the reasons we've been outlining today, and also partly because of the unpredictability of, I mean, the kind of the most powerful power in this, which is the U.S. and the unpredictability of Trump. Because there's it is he's the rhetoric has certainly changed that Israel and about Netanyahu in the last couple of weeks, but action hasn't changed. There hasn't been backed up with action, and we've seen this before. We certainly saw it under the Biden administration, and we've seen the Trump administration do something similar with the strategic leaks and all of the kind of expletive-filled phone calls that they've leaked between Netanyahu and Trump, as Biden administration did as well. And one difference is that J.D. Vance's comments and some of Trump's comments definitely went further beyond what the Biden administration said. I mean, Trump a couple of days ago at the G7, actually, was very direct in criticizing Israel's war tactics when he talked about bringing down entire apartment blocks, and he said these aren't just people with Hezbollah in there, and Biden administration never said that. And then G.D. Vance's comments last week, basically telling the Israeli government that they should be thankful for Trump being in the White House and Trump being their only ally, and they've alienated everyone else. So that's a change. I think the factor we can't entirely predict is whether Trump ultimately decides that having a deal with Iran or some kind of semi-deal is important enough for him, more important than saving Netanyahu, saving Israel, or backing them, and especially saving Netanyahu in kind of the perpetual war. Not that any of the other leading candidates for prime minister in Israel, their policies also seem to be perpetual war and destruction in the region. And so if that ultimately, and we know Trump prizes his self-interest and self-preservation above everything else. He's not a proud lifelong Zionist as Biden declared himself to be. So that's one difference, and that might actually lead to something. Trump could just get fed up with this and wants to wrap it up and doesn't care. And then it becomes some question of whether the Vance or the Rubio parts of the administration can exert more pressure on him. And that's one of the things that makes it so incredibly frustrating for Lebanese, because so much of their future is being determined by these larger forces that certainly don't have their interests at heart. And that don't particularly care about Lebanon, and I would put the U.S. certainly U.S. Israel and Iran. I mean, Iran also has figured out that Iran it proved to be a valuable asset. Hezbollah and activating the Lebanese front proved to be something very valuable for them in this war. It's not they don't particularly care about the Lebanese, unfortunately, or the level of destruction that Lebanon might undergo. So I think that's one of the core issues and one of the core frustrations, that Lebanon is at the mercy of these larger forces, where it has so little impact and so little way of exerting itself.
Thanks, Mohammed. We'll turn it over to Maya for some closing thoughts on those lines as well, and then Jad after.
Sure, very quickly. I mean, this escalation or this season of war may have an endpoint, but the war does not. The war, I don't think, will end. And I don't think it will end as long as the question of Palestine remains unresolved. As long that is really the because no matter what happens, in the next year in Lebanon, we are moving towards a future of increased, perhaps the replication of some of the aims of the quote unquote Gaza doctrine in the West Bank, in other parts of occupied Palestine. So here, what we have is a state on Lebanon's border that has decided that it is in its interest to be in a state of permanent war with its neighbors. And so that is something that is not, that cannot be sort of managed or articulated on any one side that is on the side of that place, of the state that has decided to be in a state of permanent war with its neighbors and with the people it also is occupying. So maybe I'm a little more, I think there is no end to this war until there is a resolution to the question of Palestine, a just resolution to the question of Palestine.
Thanks, Maya. And Jad, go ahead.
I absolutely agree with Maya, but I'll shift the conversation a bit towards the government and what the government can do moving forward very quickly. It is clear by now that, and I think the past 3 years proved that the previous way of doing things is no longer viable, and that is applicable politically, economically, institutionally, but nowhere is it more applicable than on the security level. People are frustrated, but the government needs to rebuild its trust with its citizens, and it can do that through several ways. One, post-war reconstruction. Destruction is massive. The Minister of Finance recently said a number of $25 billion in damages. The government can't repeat the mistake of the previous ceasefire period and not do anything about it. Homes need to be restored. Assistance has to be provided to farmers, businesses. A proper reconstruction plan has to be implemented. Two, the state has to communicate more with its citizens. This government has completely disappeared during times of crisis, during displacement, after Israeli threats, and even now during this ceasefire, people have had to make life or death decisions based on intuition, fractured media reporting, or even worse, Israeli statements because the government is absent. Three, it has to do better on reforms. People are suffocating, and lives need to be improved. Five, the army has to be strengthened, and I'm not talking only to disarm Hezbollah. A government cannot be legitimate without a proper defensive army. And lastly, and I think this is very important, the government has to change the governance culture. Successive governments have spent decades building a reputation of being extractivist, corrupt, non-accountable, non-transparent, non-reciprocal, unjust. And so this government has an obligation to change how people perceive the state. And I think when these are present, you can create a political foundation for the disarmament of Hezbollah and other non-state actors.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jad. So I know we went a little over time. Thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you to our incredible panel for the really, really solid analysis and breakdown of what's going on in and around Lebanon. We hope to do additional events very similar to this in the coming weeks and months. And so I'm just going to share Dawn's links in the chat, our website and our journal, Democracy in Exile. Please go to them, check them out, see our work. And yeah, again, thank you to our panel. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.